A rich man threw hot coffee right into a woman's face, laughing and thinking he could get away with anything. But just a few minutes later, her husband walked into the restaurant, Chuck Norris. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The rain had stopped just before sunset, leaving the streets of Austin glistening under the orange glow of the city's lamps. Cars hissed softly through shallow puddles, and the sidewalks reflected the neon shimmer of signs and headlights. On a quiet corner, the tall glass doors of a restaurant called Aura caught the last golden light. Inside, soft jazz played under the low murmur of voices and the gentle clink of silverware. The place was the kind of luxury that didn't announce itself. It breathed confidence through silence, scent, and order. The air smelled of roasted garlic and freshly ground coffee, the kind of aroma that made even silence seem expensive. Linda Norris sat by the window, a woman who carried her calm like an invisible armor. Her hair, a shade of chestnut touched with silver, was pulled neatly behind her neck, and the soft blue fabric of her dress moved faintly each time she shifted her hands on the table. Before her sat a small white card with gold edges, a note written by her husband that morning before leaving the house. The handwriting was simple, almost military in its precision. "Dinner at 7, I'll be there. Love you." She smiled faintly as she read it again, then folded it back into her purse. He was never late, but she had long learned that patience was part of his discipline. Every second he delayed was measured. Every word he said was considered. It was one of the many things she loved about him. The restaurant's lights shimmered in the window before her, and she could see her own reflection beside the dark street. Waiters glided between tables with effortless rhythm, placing wine glasses and plates like dancers trained in silence. People came here not to eat, but to prove that they belonged among those who could. Yet even here, surrounded by soft music and fine linen, the air carried that faint tension of hierarchy, the invisible contest of who could speak louder without raising their voice. At the far end of the room, a burst of laughter broke that harmony. Several guests turned, a few frowned. The sound came from a corner table where a man in a silver-gray suit sat, his posture wide and self-assured, his tie loosened like a deliberate rebellion against propriety. Richard Kingston, his name was known to most of the city's elite. He owned oil fields, real estate, and half the development projects that had turned parts of Austin into playgrounds for the rich. Money had made him untouchable. Arrogance had made him infamous. Two large men stood by his table, not eating, not talking, just standing, his bodyguards, expensive and silent. He was in his element tonight, entertaining a pair of younger executives with stories that made him laugh more than anyone else. Every few minutes he waved his hand at the waitress, ordering another drink or complaining about the temperature of his coffee. His laughter grew louder with each glass of whiskey. The restaurant's delicate balance shifted around him. People pretended not to notice, but stole glances when they thought he wasn't looking. Linda, lost in thought, didn't notice him at first. Her eyes were on the rain-streaked glass, her mind somewhere between the memory of her husband's voice and the comfort of the quiet room. Then she heard him, the low, drawn-out whistle that cut through the music like a blade. When she turned, Kingston was looking directly at her, a smile playing on his lips. The kind of smile that didn't mean politeness. His eyes moved slowly from her face to the table, then back again. "Didn't think they let angels eat alone," he said loudly, enough for nearby tables to hear. The men beside him chuckled. A few people looked away, uncomfortable. Linda's expression didn't change. "I'm waiting for someone," she said softly. "Oh, I can see that," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "Who keeps a lady like you waiting? Let me guess, some old man who doesn't know what he has." His companions laughed again, the forced laughter of men trying to keep favor. Linda's calm deepened. She turned back to the window, hoping silence would end the scene. But arrogance, like hunger, grows when ignored. Kingston pushed back his chair and rose. His steps were heavy, deliberate. He approached her table, the smell of whiskey on his breath preceding him. The room grew quieter, curiosity stirring beneath the polished manners. "I'm just trying to make conversation," he said, resting one hand on the edge of her table. "You look like you could use some company." "I'm fine, thank you," Linda answered. Her voice was polite but firm, shaped by years of patience. by the discipline of someone who had lived beside a man who taught respect through example. Kingston smiled wider. Fine? You sure? Because you look... Before he could finish, a waiter appeared, tension visible in his movements. Sir, please, you're disturbing other guests. Kingston didn't even look at him. Relax, kid. I'm a regular here. I pay enough to talk to whoever I want. The waiter hesitated, then stepped back. The power of money was stronger than his sense of duty. Linda looked at Kingston again, her eyes sharp now. Please return to your table. My husband will be here soon. The words, simple as they were, landed with an unintended weight. A few nearby diners exchanged glances. Kingston's grin faltered, curiosity flashing in his eyes. Your husband, he said slowly. And who might that be? She didn't answer. That silence irritated him more than any insult could. Well, maybe he should hurry, Kingston muttered, lifting his coffee cup. The movement seemed casual, but there was a challenge in it. You don't keep a lady waiting in a place like this. And then with an almost lazy motion, he tilted the cup and poured its contents across the table. The dark liquid splashed over Linda's hands, her dress, her cheek hot, sharp, and humiliating. She gasped, not from pain alone, but from shock. The coffee stained the pale blue fabric, steam rising faintly in the dim light. The entire restaurant froze. Forks hovered in midair. Someone dropped a spoon, and the sound rang like a bell. Kingston set the empty cup down slowly, smirking. Now you have a reason to get up, he said. The waiter moved forward again, trembling. Sir! Kingston cut him off with a glare. You want to keep your job? Stay out of this. Linda's breathing steadied. The initial shock faded, replaced by a cold stillness. She dabbed her face with a napkin, her movements precise, controlled. Her eyes met his, and for a moment Kingston felt something, an unspoken warning he couldn't quite name. Then the restaurant door opened. It wasn't loud, just the soft push of glass and wood, but the entire room seemed to react. The air changed, like the pressure before a storm. A man stepped inside wearing a dark denim jacket, simple jeans, and boots that had walked through more than one kind of dust. He removed his hat, brushed the rain from the brim, and looked around. His gaze didn't need to search. It landed on Linda immediately. The sound of the jazz seemed to fade as he crossed the floor. Each step was measured, almost too quiet for his size. There was no hurry, no aggression, just the certainty of a man who had nothing to prove. Linda looked up and whispered his name. Richard Kingston turned, already annoyed by the shift of attention. He frowned at the stranger approaching. And who the hell are you? The man didn't answer. He reached the table, placed his hat down carefully, and knelt beside Linda, his eyes scanning her face, her hands, the red marks on her skin. His touch was gentle, deliberate. Did it burn? He asked quietly. A little, she said. It's fine. He took the napkin from her hand, dipped it in the glass of water on the table, and pressed it lightly against her cheek. Only then did he stand. When he turned to Kingston, his face was calm, but his eyes steady, blue, and impossibly cold-made. The millionaire's voice catch before he could speak. No one in the restaurant moved. The man's presence filled the room like a pressure wave, silent, invisible, undeniable. The stranger extended his hand toward the waiter. A wet towel, please. The waiter nodded quickly and disappeared. Kingston recovered enough to sneer. You got a problem, cowboy? The man looked at him for a moment, studying him the way a surgeon might study an infection before deciding how to cut. His voice, when it came, was low and even. I don't have a problem, he said. You do? Kingston blinked, unsure whether to laugh or step back. Do you have any idea who I am? Yes, the man replied. The kind who throws coffee at women because no one ever taught him what a man is. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The weight in them did the work of fists. Linda whispered, Chuck, please. Chuck Norris turned slightly toward her. It's all right, he said softly, and then looking back at Kingston added, This won't take long. The first chapter closed in that suspended moment, the smell of coffee still in the air, the tension hanging like smoke. Outside, the rain began again, gentle but relentless, tapping against the windows of Aura as if counting down to what would happen next. For a heartbeat, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The rain outside pressed softly against the tall glass windows, and the world beyond blurred into streaks of light and shadow. Inside Aura, every gaze had shifted toward the man now standing beside Linda Norris. The air had changed, and even those who didn't know who he was could sense it instinctively, the way silence itself seemed to move around him. Chuck Norris stood perfectly still, one hand resting on the back of Linda's chair. His posture was relaxed, but there was something in it that made everyone at the nearest tables unconsciously straighten. His presence didn't need to be loud. It carried the weight of a man who had spent his life mastering what others mistook for anger, the art of control. The wet towel the waiter had brought lay folded neatly in his palm, and he pressed it gently against the side of Linda's face. Her skin was reddened from the coffee, but she managed a calm smile. Her eyes filled more with trust than pain. "Does it hurt much?" he asked. "Not really," she said quietly. "It's just the sting." He nodded once and placed the towel on the table. "Good. We'll get that checked later, anyway." His tone was calm, but underneath it, there was steel. He looked up at the trembling waiter. "Bring a glass of cold water and some ice, please." The waiter nodded quickly and hurried off. Richard Kingston had recovered enough from his surprise to let out a short laugh that didn't sound as confident as he wanted it to. "Well, this is cute," he said, spreading his arms. "You the husband? You think you're gonna intimidate me with that cowboy act?" Chuck turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to intimidate you," he said. "I'm here to make sure my wife's all right." "She looks fine to me," Kingston said with a grin that faltered when no one else joined in. "You gonna hit me now? That what tough guys like you do?" Chuck's voice didn't rise. "I don't hit people who are already beneath me." The words weren't shouted, yet they seemed to echo through the room. The bodyguards beside Kingston shifted uneasily. One of them, a tall man with a thick neck and the posture of someone who had spent too much time in gyms, took a step forward. "Sir, maybe we should—" Kingston waved a hand. No. Let's see what the legend does. Come on, cowboy. Show us how the movies end." Chuck took a slow breath, then looked at Linda. "Step back a little." She moved behind him, calm but watchful. The first bodyguard reached out and placed a hand on Chuck's shoulder. It was a mistake made by someone who thought size could replace sense. Before he could tighten his grip, Chuck turned slightly, his body shifting no more than an inch. His right hand caught the man's wrist, redirected it downward, and used the motion of his own balance to guide the man's arm into an arcing sweep. The guard lost his footing and landed flat on his back before anyone realized what had happened. The fall wasn't violent, but the sound of impact made several guests gasp. Chuck didn't move toward him. He simply looked down and said, "Don't get up until you understand why you're down." The second guard hesitated, torn between fear and pride. "You think you can just—" He lunged forward, reaching for Chuck's collar. The motion was fast, but Chuck was already a breath ahead. His left hand deflected the grab, while his right stepped through in a smooth pivot. The guard's balance went with it. One turn, one controlled shift of leverage, and the larger man's momentum betrayed him. Chuck guided him into the table beside Kingston's, catching him before he could crash into the glassware, lowering him gently to the floor. "I don't want anyone hurt," Chuck said evenly. "You're just doing your job, but there are better ways to earn respect than this." The man on the floor nodded, rubbing his shoulder. "Yes, sir," he muttered. For the first time that evening, Kingston didn't look amused. His eyes flicked from one bodyguard to the other, both sitting stunned but unharmed. The other patrons whispered now, their voices hushed but intense. Some had their phones out, discreetly recording. One of the waiters, trembling but emboldened, whispered, "It's him." "That's Chuck Norris." The name rippled across the room like a current. Kingston's mouth twitched into something between a smirk and a grimace. "Oh, I see," he said slowly. "Now it's all clear. The great Chuck Norris himself. What a coincidence." He laughed, but his laughter sounded thin. "You think your little celebrity act makes you immune to reality? You're in my world, old man. I could buy this entire block and have you banned from every corner of it." Chuck's face didn't move. "Money doesn't make this your world. It just means you've never learned to live in it." The restaurant's manager approached cautiously, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mr. Kingston, please, Maybe it's best if... Don't you dare finish that sentence, Kingston snapped. You know who pays for this place? You think I'll let some washed-up action hero tell me where I can sit? Chuck turned back to the manager, his voice calm. You should probably call for medical assistance. My wife's been burned. The manager nodded quickly, clearly relieved to be given something useful to do. Yes, of course, Mr. Norris. I'll call right now. As he left, Kingston sneered. You really enjoy the attention, don't you? The cameras, the people whispering your name. Must make you feel powerful again. Chuck looked down at the fallen coffee cup, its rim cracked, the dark liquid spreading slowly across the white tablecloth. Power, he said softly, is knowing you don't need to use it. He reached for another napkin, cleaning the edge of the table, the simple gesture carrying more dignity than all of Kingston's wealth could buy. Here's how this works, Kingston said, stepping closer. You apologize for embarrassing me, and I might forget this ever happened. Chuck looked at him, and for a long moment neither man spoke. When he finally did, his tone was almost kind. If you want forgiveness, you'll have to earn it yourself. The sound of rain grew louder against the glass. The manager returned, speaking hurriedly into a phone. Somewhere near the entrance, someone whispered, They're streaming this live. The glow of screens reflected off faces, the quiet hum of digital attention filling the room. Chuck noticed but said nothing. He wasn't here for spectacle. His focus stayed on Linda, who had calmed now, her breathing steady again. He could see the faint tremor in her hand, not from pain but from what had been taken from her. Dignity. That, more than the burn, was what he would address. Richard, he said at last, his voice low but firm, you're going to stop talking and sit down. Or what? Kingston said. You'll throw me too? No, Chuck replied. That's the difference between us. I don't need to humiliate you to win. Something in his voice made Kingston hesitate. The arrogance faltered, replaced for the briefest second by uncertainty. But pride is stubborn. He forced a smirk and stepped back. You think you've won something here? Chuck shook his head. Not yet. The manager returned with a small first aid kit. Chuck thanked him quietly and took the ointment, applying it gently to Linda's hand. She smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. There was gratitude there, but also pride in knowing that her husband's restraint was his greatest weapon. The door of Aura opened again as a few late diners entered, unaware of the storm inside. Outside, the thunder rolled far away, like a slow drumbeat. Inside, the tension held steady, a coiled spring waiting for its release. Chuck placed the cap on the ointment and stood once more. His gaze met Kingston's across the table. This isn't over yet, he said, but how it ends depends on you. Kingston opened his mouth to reply, but the words never formed. The faint sound of approaching sirens echoed outside. Someone, perhaps a nervous waiter, had called the police. The color drained slightly from Kingston's face. For the first time that evening, he realized the rules of power were shifting. Chuck turned back to Linda. We'll go soon, he said softly. You've had enough of this place. As they stood, the crowd parted without a word. People moved instinctively, making room for them. No one dared to speak until the couple reached the door. Chuck paused for a moment, feeling the eyes of everyone on his back. He turned slightly toward Kingston. You should think about what you threw, he said quietly. Coffee cools down fast. Reputations don't. Then he opened the door, letting the night air sweep into the restaurant. The rain had slowed to a mist, the streets glistening once again. As they stepped outside, the soft thud of thunder followed them, and the hum of voices rose behind the glass. The night had changed for everyone in Aura. For some, it was just a story they'd tell. For Richard Kingston, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And for Chuck Norris, it was the first test of a lesson he'd learned long ago, that sometimes silence is the hardest strike of all. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving Austin under a washed silver sky. The streets steamed faintly, and sunlight filtered through the low clouds as if testing the strength of the new day. The story of what had happened inside Aura the night before had already begun to move beyond its walls. The restaurant staff whispered, the patrons who had filmed the confrontation uploaded their videos before they even paid their bills, and by dawn, the name Richard Kingston was echoing through 1,000 screens. The video wasn't long, 2 minutes of grainy footage showing a billionaire throwing coffee into a woman's face in the quiet arrival of the man who stood between them. But it was enough. The internet didn't need context when outrage was so simple to recognize. Chuck and Linda sat at their kitchen table as the morning light crept across the hardwood floor. The house was quiet except for the sound of the coffee machine. Linda's hand was bandaged, the burn mild but still tender. Chuck had made her sit down, insisting on taking care of breakfast. The smell of toast and freshly brewed coffee filled the room. It was domestic, peaceful, the kind of calm that belonged to people who had seen chaos and learned to live beyond it. "They're calling it the Aura incident," Linda said softly, scrolling through the headlines on her phone. "There's video everywhere." "I figured there would be," Chuck replied. He poured coffee into 2 cups, placed one in front of her, and sat down across the table. "People film faster than they think these days." She glanced at him. "You're not worried?" "About what?" "About how they'll twist it. You know how stories spread online. They could make it sound like you were looking for trouble." Chuck stirred his coffee once, the spoon clinking softly. "They can write what they want. I know what happened. You know what happened. That's enough for me." Linda smiled faintly. "You really believe that's enough in this world?" "I have to," he said. "Otherwise, the noise wins." Meanwhile, across town, in a high-rise of glass and steel that reflected the entire skyline, Richard Kingston's world was unraveling. He sat behind his massive walnut desk, surrounded by the kind of silence that follows catastrophe. The lights of his office were dim. The only brightness came from the screens in front of him, each one displaying the same video, the same moment he wished he could erase. His public relations director stood by the window, speaking quickly into a headset. His legal advisor hovered near the door, a folder clutched like a shield. The board of directors had already called twice. Investors were demanding explanations. The headlines were relentless. "Billionaire abuses woman in public restaurant. Military hero intervenes." Kingston slammed his fist on the desk. "Turn it off," he shouted. The PR director lowered his voice, ending the call. "Sir, we can't make it disappear. It's everywhere. People are copying the video, reposting it, editing it. There are reaction videos, interviews with witnesses." "I don't care," Kingston barked. "I'll sue them all, every single one of them." The legal advisor spoke carefully, as if tiptoeing through a minefield. "Sir, you can't sue the internet, and the witnesses, there are too many. This isn't about the footage anymore. It's about perception, public sentiment." Kingston turned toward him, his face red. "You're telling me I should apologize to that? What is she? Some movie wife. That's your strategy?" The advisor hesitated. "I'm saying that maybe you should issue a statement of regret. It would be prudent." Kingston laughed, bitter and sharp. "Regret? I don't regret anything. I was humiliated in my own city by some washed-up fighter with a cowboy complex." But even as he spoke, something inside him faltered. The memory of that moment, the calm in Chuck Norris's eyes, the effortless way he dismantled his guards without breaking a sweat kept replaying like a curse. Kingston had been in boardrooms that decided the fate of entire companies, had spoken before governors and billionaires, but none of them had made him feel that small. And worse, the world had seen it. In the next room, his secretary's phone kept ringing. The caller ID flashed constantly. News networks, journalists, talk shows, even podcasts. Everyone wanted his statement. He ignored them all. But he couldn't ignore the notifications lighting up his own phone messages from business partners, politicians, and his wife, all asking the same thing. "What did you do?" He poured himself a drink, though it was barely 10 in the morning. His reflection in the office glass looked older than he remembered. For the first time, he felt the faint pull of fear. Not of losing money, but of losing face. By noon, Kingston incident was trending in 20 countries. Bloggers dissected every frame of the footage. Someone dug up old lawsuits involving his companies. Another found clips of former employees accusing him of bullying. The internet had scented blood, and it didn't let go. Meanwhile, Chuck and Linda went about their day. He took her to the small medical clinic near the lake for a checkup. The doctor assured them the burn would heal without scarring. When they left, a woman in the waiting room approached quietly. She was in her 40s, holding a toddler on her lap. "Mrs. Norris," she said shyly, "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened, what your husband did. Thank you. People need to see that kind of strength." Linda smiled warmly. "He's stronger when he stays calm," she said. The woman nodded, her eyes shining. "I wish more men were like that." Chuck didn't say anything, but as they walked to the car, Linda noticed his expression change. It wasn't pride, it was something quieter, a kind of sadness for what people had come to expect from the world. Back in his office, Kingston tried to wrestle back control. His PR team drafted a statement full of words like misunderstanding and deep regret. He deleted every version they sent. "I'm not apologizing to anyone," he repeated. "This will blow over. It always does." But it didn't. By evening, his board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting. Investors were withdrawing. Sponsors canceled appearances. His wife refused to come home. The empire he had built on fear and money was starting to crumble under the weight of a few minutes of truth. In another part of the city, a local news anchor reported on the story. The footage played again on the screen behind her. Kingston throwing coffee, the silence that followed, then Chuck's entrance measured, calm, like a force of nature. The anchor's voice carried both admiration and disbelief. "A reminder," she said, "that dignity can be stronger than anger." Chuck watched it later that night with Linda. He didn't smile. "They'll make it a spectacle," he murmured. Linda touched his arm. "Maybe it's not about them. Maybe it's about everyone watching. Maybe someone out there learned something from it." He looked at her, then nodded slowly. "Maybe." Across town, Kingston sat alone in the dark. His phone vibrated again. Another message. Another demand for answers. This time, it wasn't from the media. It was from someone on his own board. "We need to talk. You've become a liability." He stared at the message for a long time before tossing the phone aside. On his desk lay the printed headlines of the day. He read the same words over and over. "Billionaire abuses veteran's wife. Public demands accountability. Norris teaches a masterclass in restraint." The words felt like chains tightening around his chest. For the first time, he realized he couldn't buy silence anymore. Outside, thunder rolled again over the city. The storm wasn't over, it had only changed shape. And as the night deepened, both men sat awake in different worlds, each wrestling with the same truth, that once reputation begins to burn, no amount of money or pride can put out the fire. The sun was setting when Richard Kingston decided to reclaim control of his own narrative. His office, once a temple of confidence, now felt like a trap. The screens that had once displayed market data now showed talking heads discussing his fall from grace. Every word they spoke about him was a wound. Arrogance, abuse, humiliation. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress of power around himself, and in a single night, one quiet man had made it collapse without even raising his voice. Kingston poured another drink, though his hands shook as he did it. His reflection in the office window seemed smaller, older, almost unfamiliar. He whispered to himself, as though the glass could understand, "It's all about control. It always has been." But deep down, he knew he had lost it. When the call came from his attorney that evening, he was told the restaurant's security footage had been subpoenaed. "There's no use fighting it," the lawyer said. "The world's already seen enough." Kingston slammed the phone down and cursed, but the rage had no direction. He was angry at everything at the restaurant, the cameras, the phones, at Chuck Norris, and most of all, at himself. Pride had been his weapon for years, and now it was the blade cutting his own hand. That same evening, across town, Chuck and Linda sat on the porch of their home, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The crickets had begun their chorus, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves filled the quiet spaces between them. Linda's hand had almost healed. She held a cup of tea, and the steam curled gently into the cool air. Chuck had been silent for a long while, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. "Are you thinking about him?" Linda asked softly. Chuck nodded. "I'm thinking about what kind of man he was before all this. Nobody starts cruel. Somewhere along the way, they just forget what being human feels like." Linda looked at him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "You still find a way to feel sorry for him." He smiled faintly. "Pity and forgiveness aren't the same thing." but they both help you sleep at night." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think he'll ever understand what he did?" "Maybe," Chuck said quietly, "if the world doesn't crush him first." The next day, Aura opened again, but the atmosphere had changed. The tables where Kingston once sat were empty, and the staff moved with a strange sense of reverence. The incident had become legend overnight. Some came to see where it happened. Others came to feel what they called the energy of that night. The manager, a thin man named Peter, had spent the last 2 days replaying the footage in his mind, haunted not by Kingston's cruelty, but by Chuck's restraint. It had been a lesson no one in the room could forget, the way a man could stop violence not with his fists, but with the silence that followed them. It was almost noon when Chuck returned to the restaurant, unannounced. Peter recognized him immediately and nearly dropped the stack of menus he was holding. "Mr. Norris," he stammered, "I didn't expect—" "I came to pay for our meal," Chuck said simply. "I heard the car didn't go through after everything that happened." Peter blinked. "Sir, that dinner was on the house. After what you did—" "I didn't do it for a discount," Chuck interrupted gently. "I did it because it was right." He placed an envelope on the counter and nodded. "There's enough in there for the meal and something extra for your staff. They were put in a tough spot." Peter swallowed hard. "Thank you, Mr. Norris. You've given everyone here something to remember." Chuck smiled faintly. "Then make sure they remember the right part." Meanwhile, in Kingston's world, things had only gotten worse. His name was poison in business circles. The board had called another emergency meeting, and this time, they didn't ask for his input. They demanded his resignation. The letter had already been drafted. He refused to sign it at first, pacing the length of the conference room like a caged animal, shouting that this was all temporary. But the faces around the table were cold, detached, professional. To them, he was no longer a leader, but a liability. When he finally signed, the pen left a deep groove in the paper, as though trying to carve his defiance into history. After the meeting, Kingston sat in his car, staring at the city skyline. He had built half of those buildings, but they now looked like monuments to someone else's life. His phone buzzed constantly, reporters, investors, people who wanted statements or apologies. But there was one message that caught his attention, a text from his own son. "Dad, maybe you should just say sorry. People would respect that more than pretending it didn't happen." He stared at the words for a long time, the drink in his hand forgotten. His son had never spoken to him like that before, simple, honest, unguarded. Kingston's pride fought it, but something in his chest cracked open. He set the phone down and covered his face with both hands. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt human, and it terrified him. That night, as darkness settled over the city, Kingston drove to Aura. The staff recognized him immediately. The room fell silent as he entered. He had no bodyguards this time, no entourage, no arrogance in his step. He walked to the same table where it had all happened, where he had poured coffee onto an innocent woman's face. The memory played in his mind like a cruel film, every frame clearer than the last. Chuck was already there. He had chosen the same corner seat, not by coincidence, but by instinct. When Kingston approached, Chuck looked up calmly. "Evening," he said. Kingston's voice was hoarse. "I didn't expect you'd be here." "I figured you'd come sooner or later," Chuck said. "Some men only learn when they have to face the mirror." Kingston sat down slowly. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Chuck shook his head. "No, I just think I remember who I am." The words stung more than Kingston wanted to admit. He looked down at the table, at the faint stains that still lingered on the wood despite all the cleaning. "I was drunk, angry. I didn't mean—" Chuck leaned forward. "You meant every word, Richard. You just didn't mean to face the consequences." Kingston's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what it's like being me." "I understand perfectly," Chuck said quietly. "You think control is power, but real power is knowing when to stop. You couldn't stop yourself that night, and now everything around you is stopping for you." Kingston's hands clenched into fists, then relaxed. For the first time, he didn't have a response. The silence stretched between them, heavy and honest. Finally, Chuck spoke again. You have a choice right now. Keep pretending you were the victim, or stand up and admit you were wrong. One road might save your pride. The other might save your soul. Kingston looked at him, the old arrogance fading from his eyes. And if I say sorry, it changes nothing. The internet already hates me. Then do it for something bigger than the internet, Chuck said. Do it for yourself, for your family, for the people who believed in you before you became the man who threw coffee at a stranger. Kingston stared at him for a long moment. Then he exhaled and stood. The manager watched from a distance, uncertain whether to intervene. Kingston raised his voice slightly, enough for the few diners to hear. I'm sorry, he said, the words stumbling out awkwardly at first, as though they had to fight their way past years of pride. I was wrong that night. I disrespected someone who didn't deserve it. I thought my money could erase anything, but I see now that it can't. The room remained silent for a moment, and then one by one people began to nod. The apology was imperfect, clumsy, but real. Chuck stood, placed a hand on Kingston's shoulder and said, That's a start. When they left the restaurant together, the night air was cool and clear. Kingston looked up at the stars, something he hadn't done in years. It's strange, he said softly. Apologizing feels harder than fighting ever did. Chuck smiled. That's because real strength doesn't need an audience. They parted at the corner, one walking toward a life he'd almost destroyed, the other returning to a home filled with quiet peace. Behind them, aura glowed softly in the darkness, the place where arrogance had met discipline, and where one man had finally learned that power wasn't about domination, but about restraint. In the days that followed, the city's chatter began to shift. The fury that had once filled every corner of the internet slowly cooled, leaving behind something quieter, but no less powerful reflection. The video of Richard Kingston's public apology had spread almost as far as the first scandal. People were divided about whether he deserved forgiveness, but one thing was clear. The man who had stood trembling under the restaurant lights was not the same one who had strutted through them days earlier. The world had seen him break, and whether that breaking was punishment or rebirth would depend on what he did next. For Richard, the days after the apology were heavy with silence. His mansion, once filled with constant voices, assistants, chefs, advisors, was empty now. His wife had taken their daughter to stay with her parents. His son still texted him occasionally, but their conversations were short, awkward, uncertain. He no longer had the energy to perform the role of the invincible magnate. The quiet echoed through the halls like judgment. For the first time in decades, he could hear his own thoughts without interruption, and they were not kind. He spent long hours walking through his house, stopping in rooms he hadn't truly looked at in years. Every piece of art, every imported chair, every marble counter now felt absurdly hollow. The house smelled faintly of whiskey and dust. He would sit in his office for hours, staring at the resignation letter he'd been forced to sign. His empire had gone on without him. The board had issued its own statement about restructuring and realigning company values. He was mentioned only once, in a single sentence at the bottom, a reminder of how quickly wealth forgets its makers. One night, unable to sleep, Richard turned on the television. A news report showed a group of veterans helping rebuild homes for flood victims in another state. Their faces were worn but content, their laughter real. It reminded him of something Chuck had said that night in Aura. You couldn't stop yourself, and now everything around you is stopping for you. He sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, the sound of their hammering echoing through his mind. The next morning, he made a decision that surprised even him. He called his attorney and asked for the contact information of the local Veterans Foundation. I want to meet them, he said simply. The lawyer hesitated, assuming it was another PR move. There's no press, Richard added. No cameras, just me. It took him 2 days to gather the courage. The Veterans Center was a modest brick building near the outskirts of the city, surrounded by old oak trees and the smell of cut grass. The parking lot was half empty. Inside, the air was filled with quiet conversation and the distant sound of laughter from a group playing cards in the back. When Richard stepped through the door, the receptionist looked up, startled. Recognition flashed in her eyes, but she said nothing. He took off his sunglasses and spoke in a subdued voice. My name is Richard Kingston. I'd like to speak to whoever runs this place. Moments later, a tall man in his 40s appeared from a side office. His left leg was a prosthetic, his handshake firm but measured. "You're the guy from the news," he said, his tone neutral. "I was," Richard replied. "I'm here because I'd like to help." The man studied him for a long moment. "You want to help veterans?" "I want to start by listening to them," Richard said. That afternoon became his first real lesson in humility. He sat at a table surrounded by people who had known pain he could barely imagine, men and women who had lost limbs, friends and homes, yet still carried themselves with more dignity than he ever had in his wealthiest years. They told him stories not of heroism, but of endurance, of finding work after being forgotten, of rebuilding marriages and families. He didn't speak much. For once, he just listened. When he finally did speak, his voice trembled slightly. "I spent my life thinking power was something you took from people. Now I see it's something you earn by what you give back." The man with the prosthetic nodded. "Took you long enough to learn it, but it's a start." After that day, Richard began showing up every week. He didn't arrive in suits anymore, just jeans and a shirt. He helped organize donations, stock supplies, even clean floors when needed. At first, the others didn't trust his presence, assuming it was some redemption performance. But over time, his quiet persistence spoke louder than his reputation. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no speeches, just a man slowly learning to stand differently. Across town, Chuck heard about it through a mutual friend. One evening, he mentioned it to Linda as they sat watching the sunset from their porch. "He's helping at the Veterans Center now," Chuck said. Linda looked surprised. "You believe it's real?" "I think people can change," he said, "but only if they're willing to stay changed when nobody's watching." She smiled. "You gave him a hard lesson, Chuck." He shook his head. "Life gave it to him. I just didn't get in the way." As the weeks passed, something in Richard began to shift. He started sleeping again. The house didn't feel quite as cold. His wife returned one weekend, not because she forgave him completely, but because she saw that he had become quieter, gentler. He didn't talk about business anymore. He talked about the people he met at the center, about the veterans teaching him carpentry, about rebuilding a shelter in the rain. Then came the day of the charity event, a local fundraiser for wounded soldiers. Richard had been asked to attend, not as a guest of honor, but as a volunteer. He set up chairs, poured drinks, and blended into the crowd. Toward the end of the evening, he noticed Chuck and Linda walk through the doors. They hadn't planned to see each other again, but fate, it seemed, enjoyed symmetry. Their eyes met across the room. For a brief moment, the noise around them faded. Chuck approached first, extending his hand. "You've been busy," he said with a hint of a smile. Richard took the handshake firmly. "Trying to make myself useful. Turns out it's harder than it looks." "It usually is," Chuck replied, "but it lasts longer than money." Richard nodded, his voice lower now. "I don't know if I can ever undo what I did." Chuck studied him for a moment. "You can't, but you can make sure it means something." Linda joined them, her expression calm. "How are you doing, Mr. Kingston?" she asked softly. "I'm learning," he said. "Slowly, but I'm learning." For the first time, there was no tension between them, only a quiet understanding that life sometimes allowed second chances, not to erase the past, but to build something better from its ruins. By the time the evening ended, Richard stood outside the hall watching the last guests leave. The night air was cool, the stars clear above the city. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight in his chest lighten, not gone, but finally movable. He knew he would carry the memory of his failure for the rest of his life, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like a reminder. Back at home, he sat at his desk and began to write a letter. Not for the press, not for his board, but for Chuck. The words came slowly, but each one was honest. He thanked him not for forgiveness, but for the lesson. He ended it with a single line. "You were right. Real power isn't about control. It's about what we choose not to destroy." When the letter was finished, he sealed it and set it aside. Then he turned off the lights, walked out onto the balcony, and looked toward the city that had once bowed to him. It didn't bow anymore, and that was fine. For the first time in his life, Richard Kingston didn't want the world at his feet. He just wanted to walk in it, like a man who had finally learned how to stand. Spring came early that year, soft and green, washing away the heaviness of winter. The rains were lighter now, and the city of Austin breathed again after months of gray skies. It had been nearly a year since that night at Aura, and time, as it often does, had woven silence around the memory, softening the sharp edges, but never erasing them completely. What had begun as a moment of humiliation had become something deeper, a quiet story of change, whispered between those who had seen it and those who had learned from it. Chuck and Linda were back to their quiet rhythm of life, the kind that grows only in homes built on mutual respect. Their mornings were simple: coffee, conversation, the soft hum of the radio. The garden behind their house had come alive with color. Chuck spent hours tending it, pruning the rose bushes and checking the soil. It wasn't about the flowers. It was about balance, patience, the same lessons he taught in every dojo, every encounter, every breath. Linda would often watch him from the porch, her book forgotten in her lap, knowing that beneath that calm exterior lived a man who had spent his life learning when not to fight. One morning, as the sunlight spilled across the table, she placed a white envelope in front of him. "You got something in the mail," she said. Chuck looked at it, seeing the name before he opened it: Richard Kingston. The handwriting was steady, almost restrained. He took a moment, sipping his coffee before tearing it open. The letter was short, written on plain paper. "Mr. Norris, it's been nearly a year since that night. I won't pretend that I've erased it, but I've tried to build something better in its place. The Veterans Center has grown. We're opening 2 more across the state. I've sold most of what I once called my empire. It felt strange at first, giving away the things that once defined me. But I think I'm starting to understand what you meant about control. I've also spoken to my son. He forgave me, though I'm still learning to deserve it. Thank you for showing me that real power isn't in owning the world. It's in facing it without fear. Richard Kingston." Chuck read it twice, his face unreadable. Then he folded the letter neatly and set it aside. "He's learning," he said quietly. Linda smiled. "You think he's changed for good?" "Maybe not forever," Chuck replied, "but long enough to make a difference. That's more than most people get." He stood and walked to the mantel. On it, framed beside a photo of his old martial arts class, hung the letter Kingston had written months earlier, the first apology that had come before this one. Beneath it was a photograph, a small group of veterans standing in front of a newly painted building with the sign Kingston Foundation for Recovery. Chuck reached out and adjusted the frame. "People can change," he murmured. "Sometimes they just need to lose everything to find out who they really are." Later that week, he and Linda decided to visit the center. When they arrived, the sun was high, and the building gleamed with fresh white paint. Outside, a group of volunteers worked on a playground for the children of veterans. The laughter carried across the yard. Richard was there, kneeling beside a pile of lumber, hammer in hand. He wore jeans and a simple shirt, his sleeves rolled up. He didn't see them at first, too focused on measuring a board, but when he did, he froze for a moment before standing. His face was older, leaner, marked by humility rather than pride. "Mr. Norris," he said, walking over, wiping sweat from his brow. "I wasn't expecting you." "Didn't want you to," Chuck said. "Just wanted to see how it was going." Richard gestured to the building behind him. "Better than I deserve, he said with a small laugh. "But we're doing good work. These guys—" He pointed toward a few veterans carrying supplies. "They taught me more than any business school ever could. I still get things wrong, but I try to make them right faster." Chuck nodded. "That's all anyone can do." There was a pause between them, not of tension, but of recognition. Richard took a breath. "I framed your letter," he said suddenly, "the one you sent me after the apology. You wrote, 'Don't let this lesson fade when the world stops watching.' It's been my reminder every day." Chuck looked at him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Then you're doing all right." They walked together toward the small courtyard behind the center. A memorial stood there now, a simple stone wall engraved with the names of veterans who had lost their lives after returning home. A brass plaque at the bottom read, "Strength isn't what you show the world. It's what you use to hold it together." Linda ran her fingers over the engraving, tears quietly glistening in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Richard stood beside her, his voice lower. I wanted to honor what I tried to destroy. That night, I thought strength meant being untouchable. Now I know it means being human. They stayed until sunset. As the light faded, Chuck turned toward him. You ever go back to Aura? He asked. Once, Richard said. They still have the same table. The manager told me they never sanded out the stain from that night. Said it's there to remind people that some lessons aren't meant to be erased. Chuck looked thoughtful. He's right. When they parted ways, the evening air was cool and filled with the scent of new blossoms. Richard watched the couple drive away, then turned back toward the center. The sound of laughter and the hum of hammers echoed behind him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an observer in his own life. He was part of something larger, something cleaner. That night, Chuck sat with Linda on their porch again. The stars were out, scattered across the Texas sky like fragments of quiet truth. He leaned back, the wood creaking softly beneath them. Funny thing about power, he said, everyone spends their life trying to hold it. But the real trick is knowing when to let go. Linda looked at him, her eyes gentle in the starlight. And if you let go too soon, he smiled, then you learn to hold on to what matters instead. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence for a long time. Somewhere far away, a train horn echoed across the plains. The world had moved on, but its lessons remained etched not in fame or fortune, but in the quiet victories of those who had learned the hardest truth of all. That strength, real strength, lives not in the hand that strikes, but in the heart that chooses not to. In the living room, under the framed letter and photograph, the evening light fell across a small inscription Chuck had placed beneath them. It read simply, "Power is not what you can take, it's what you can walk away from." And as the house filled with the peace of another ending day, it seemed as though the world outside had finally caught up to that truth. Before you go, don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. The next episode will change the way you see power and redemption forever. Watch the other stories on this channel. Each one reveals a truth you won't believe until you see it yourself. Share this video with your friends and let them decide, what would they have done that night?